The moment you stop chasing her, something unexpected happens. The silence you create becomes louder than all the attention you were giving. Suddenly, the woman who seemed distant starts thinking about you more than she did when you were constantly available. But why does this happen? What exactly goes through her mind when you stop chasing? Stay until the end, because the final point reveals the psychological shift that changes everything in relationships. The very first thing that goes through her mind when you stop chasing is confusion, not because she was necessarily deeply attached, but because human beings become accustomed to patterns. When someone consistently texts first, checks in regularly, initiates conversations, compliments us, and makes their interest obvious, that behavior slowly becomes part of our expectations. We stop noticing it as something special because it feels normal. It becomes a routine. The attention is no longer surprising because it is always there. This is why many people fail to understand the value of someone's effort while they are receiving it. The mind adapts quickly to consistency. What once felt exciting eventually becomes predictable. So when the man who was always present suddenly becomes less available, less eager, or completely silent, her mind immediately notices the disruption. The change stands out because it breaks the pattern she had become comfortable with. Suddenly, something feels different, and that difference demands an explanation. What makes this psychological shift so powerful is that people are naturally uncomfortable with unanswered questions. The human brain is designed to seek certainty. It wants reasons, explanations, and conclusions. When your behavior changes without a clear explanation, her mind automatically starts searching for answers. She may replay previous conversations, analyze your recent interactions, and look for clues that could explain why things are no longer the same. She might wonder if she said something wrong, if she unintentionally pushed you away, or if something happened in your life that changed your priorities. Even if she was not fully invested before, curiosity begins to develop because the situation no longer makes sense. The person who was consistently pursuing her is no longer doing so. And that unexpected shift creates a psychological gap that her mind feels compelled to fill. Another reason this thought becomes so dominant is because consistency creates a sense of security. Whether she openly acknowledged it or not, she knew your attention would be there. She knew that if she took longer to reply, you would probably message again. She knew that if conversations became one-sided, you would continue making an effort. There was comfort in knowing exactly where she stood. When that certainty disappears, the emotional environment changes. Now there is unpredictability. The attention she once assumed would always be available is no longer guaranteed. This forces her to become aware of something she may never have considered before: your absence. Ironically, people often notice what is missing far more intensely than what is constantly present. Your presence blended into the background because it was expected. Your absence becomes impossible to ignore because it is unexpected. The mind also tends to assign greater value to things that become less accessible. When attention is freely available, it can easily be overlooked. But when it is withdrawn, people begin questioning why it was removed. This is not always about romantic attraction. It is a basic psychological response. She starts paying attention to the very thing she previously paid little attention to. The silence becomes noticeable. The lack of messages becomes noticeable. The missing interactions become noticeable. She may find herself checking her phone more often than usual, wondering whether you will reach out. She may revisit old conversations and think about moments she had previously dismissed. The change captures her attention because it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally generates focus. What often surprises her most is how quickly she notices the difference. While she may have assumed that your attention was simply a permanent part of her daily life, the moment it disappears, she realizes how much space it occupied. The messages she once responded to casually are no longer arriving. The conversations that once happened effortlessly are no longer taking place. The emotional energy that was consistently directed toward her has suddenly been redirected elsewhere or removed completely. This realization causes her to look at the situation from a completely different perspective. Instead of asking whether you are interested in her, she begins asking why you are no longer showing the same level of interest. The focus shifts from your pursuit of her to her curiosity about you, and that curiosity continues growing as long as the question remains unanswered. Once the initial confusion begins to settle, another powerful thought often starts forming in her mind. Did I misjudge his value? This question does not appear instantly. It develops gradually as she gains distance from the constant attention she once received. When someone is always available, always reaching out, always making the effort, it becomes easy to focus on their pursuit rather than their actual qualities. Their consistency can unintentionally overshadow their value. Instead of being appreciated for who they are, they become associated with what they provide. Their attention becomes expected, their effort becomes routine, and their presence becomes something that seems guaranteed. Because of this, many people never fully evaluate the person standing in front of them while they are actively pursuing. They evaluate the pursuit itself. The moment that pursuit disappears, the perspective begins to change. Distance has a unique way of creating clarity. When you are constantly present in someone's life, they rarely have a reason to reflect on your importance. Reflection often happens in absence, not in abundance. When your messages stop arriving, when your attention is no longer available on demand, and when your energy is no longer centered around her, she is given something she did not have before: space to think. For the first time, she is not reacting to your effort in real time. Instead, she is looking back at it. She starts remembering conversations, moments of support, acts of kindness, and qualities that may have gone unnoticed while they were happening. Things that once seemed ordinary begin to appear different when viewed through the lens of absence. What felt common suddenly feels rare. What felt guaranteed suddenly feels valuable. Many people underestimate how much emotional value becomes visible only after it is gone. While you were present, she may have focused on what you lacked. Perhaps she focused on imperfections, small mistakes, or reasons why she was uncertain. Human beings often do this because when something is consistently available, the mind naturally shifts its attention toward flaws rather than benefits. The positives become familiar, and familiarity reduces appreciation. Once the person is no longer chasing, however, the balance changes. The flaws that once seemed significant begin to shrink, while the qualities that were overlooked begin to stand out. She may start realizing how patient you were, how genuine your intentions were, how consistently you showed up, and how rare it is to find someone willing to invest that level of effort without expecting immediate rewards. This realization can create an internal conflict. On one hand, she remembers the reasons she may not have fully appreciated you at the time. On the other hand, she begins recognizing qualities that are increasingly difficult to replace. She may compare you to other people in her life and notice differences she previously ignored. She may realize that while others offered excitement, they lacked consistency. While others were confident, they lacked sincerity. While others captured attention, they failed to provide emotional security. Comparisons like these often happen naturally because the human mind constantly evaluates experiences relative to one another. The absence of your attention forces her to examine your overall value rather than simply responding to your pursuit. What makes this process even more significant is that appreciation tends to grow when effort is no longer being actively demonstrated. While you were chasing, your actions may have been viewed as something you were supposed to do because of your interest. Once you stop, those same actions begin to look like choices rather than obligations. She starts understanding that every message, every conversation, every moment of patience, and every effort to stay connected was something you willingly gave. The realization shifts her perception. Instead of seeing someone who was simply pursuing her, she begins seeing someone who consistently invested time, energy, and emotional attention. The focus moves away from what she was receiving and toward the person who was giving it, creating a deeper awareness of qualities that may have remained hidden beneath the familiarity of constant attention. One of the most powerful thoughts that can enter her mind when you stop chasing is the question, is he giving his attention to someone else? This thought is not always driven by jealousy in the traditional sense. It is often driven by uncertainty. For a long time, she may have known exactly where your attention was directed. She knew that you were interested. She knew that you would reach out. She knew that your focus remained on her, regardless of how much effort she gave in return. That certainty created a predictable dynamic. Whether she fully appreciated it or not, she understood her position in your life. When you suddenly stop chasing, however, that certainty begins to disappear. The attention that once felt guaranteed is no longer visible, and the mind naturally starts searching for explanations. One of the most common explanations it creates is the possibility that someone else is now receiving the attention that was once directed toward her. Human beings are highly sensitive to changes in social dynamics. We instinctively pay attention to shifts in status, priorities, and emotional investment. When someone who was once highly focused on us suddenly becomes distant, it creates a psychological question that demands an answer. The mind rarely accepts uncertainty without attempting to resolve it. Because she can no longer clearly see your interest, she begins imagining different possibilities. Perhaps you became busy. Perhaps you lost interest completely. But among all the possible explanations, one of the most emotionally impactful is the idea that another woman may now be receiving your time, energy, and attention. Even if there is no evidence supporting this belief, the mere possibility can become enough to occupy her thoughts. This happens because attention is one of the most valuable resources people exchange in relationships. Attention represents interest. It represents emotional investment. It represents priority. When someone consistently gives attention, they communicate that you matter to them. When that attention suddenly disappears, the mind immediately wonders where it went. Very few people assume that attention simply vanishes. Instead, they often assume it has been redirected. This is why she may start questioning whether you have met someone new, whether another woman has captured your interest, or whether someone else now occupies the emotional space she once held. These thoughts can arise even when she never intended to pursue a deeper relationship herself. The possibility of losing access to someone's attention often creates a stronger emotional reaction than having access to it in the first place. Another important psychological factor is that people tend to value opportunities differently when competition becomes possible. When your attention was exclusively available to her, there may have been little urgency to evaluate its worth. There was no perceived threat of losing it. But the moment she suspects that someone else could receive what she once took for granted, the situation changes dramatically. Suddenly, your attention appears more valuable because it is no longer guaranteed. This is not manipulation. It is a natural human response. Scarcity increases perceived value. The less available something becomes, the more attention people pay to it. If she starts believing that another woman may appreciate qualities she overlooked, she may begin reassessing those qualities herself. The imagination often intensifies these thoughts even further. In the absence of information, the mind creates stories. She may picture you having conversations with someone else. She may imagine another woman enjoying the attention she once received. She may wonder whether someone else is now seeing the qualities she failed to fully appreciate. These imagined scenarios can become surprisingly powerful because they are fueled by uncertainty rather than facts. The less she knows about what caused your change in behavior, the more room her imagination has to fill the gaps. Every unanswered question creates another opportunity for speculation, and every moment of silence allows curiosity to grow stronger. What makes this psychological shift particularly significant is that the focus is no longer entirely on whether you want her. Instead, her attention begins turning toward whether someone else may want you. That subtle change alters the entire dynamic. Rather than seeing you as someone who is simply pursuing her, she starts viewing you as someone whose attention, energy, and emotional investment may now be desired elsewhere. The realization that your focus is no longer fixed on her creates uncertainty, curiosity, and a growing awareness that the attention she once considered permanent may have never been permanent at all. One of the most surprising experiences a woman can have after a man stops chasing is realizing that she is thinking about him far more than she did when he was actively pursuing her. This can feel confusing because it seems to contradict logic. When someone is constantly present in your life, constantly communicating and constantly expressing interest, you would expect them to occupy a significant amount of mental space. Yet the opposite often happens. When a person is always available, there is very little reason to think about them because they are already there. Their presence becomes a certainty rather than a question. The mind does not need to search for answers, fill in gaps, or wonder about possibilities. Everything feels predictable, but when that person suddenly becomes less available, something changes. The certainty disappears and the mind begins paying attention in a completely different way. Human psychology is deeply influenced by unresolved situations. People naturally seek completion. They want answers to unanswered questions and explanations for unexpected changes. When you stop chasing, you create a gap in a pattern that had become familiar. That gap immediately attracts attention. Suddenly, there is something her mind cannot fully explain. The messages that once arrived consistently are gone. The effort she expected is no longer visible. The person whose interest seemed obvious is now difficult to read. This uncertainty creates mental activity because the brain dislikes loose ends. It wants to understand what happened. It wants to know why things changed. It wants to predict what will happen next. The more unanswered questions exist, the more frequently the mind returns to them. This is why she may find herself thinking about moments that never seemed important before. Conversations she barely remembered suddenly become significant. Small interactions begin replaying in her mind. She may revisit old messages, remember jokes you shared, or think about details she overlooked while everything was happening in real time. The absence of new interactions causes the mind to focus on existing memories. Without fresh communication to replace old experiences, those experiences become more prominent. What once felt ordinary begins taking on greater emotional significance simply because it is no longer being reinforced by constant new contact. Another reason she begins thinking about you more is that mystery naturally attracts attention. When everything is known, curiosity fades, but when information becomes limited, curiosity grows. During the period when you were chasing, your intentions were obvious. She knew how you felt. She knew what you wanted. There was little mystery surrounding your actions because they were consistently visible. Once you stop chasing, however, the certainty disappears. She no longer knows what you are thinking. She no longer knows how you feel. She no longer knows whether your feelings changed, whether you moved on, or whether something significant happened. The lack of information creates curiosity, and curiosity has a powerful ability to keep someone mentally occupied. The mind is also naturally drawn toward things that feel incomplete. Relationships, connections, and emotional experiences often leave lasting impressions when there is no clear conclusion. If your pursuit suddenly ends without a dramatic argument, a formal goodbye, or a clear explanation, she may feel as though the story remains unfinished. Unfinished situations tend to linger in the mind because they leave room for interpretation. People replay events repeatedly, searching for clues they may have missed. They imagine different outcomes, alternative conversations, and possible explanations. The emotional energy that was once invested in responding to your attention becomes redirected toward understanding your absence. What makes this process even more powerful is that thinking about someone often increases emotional awareness. The more frequently she reflects on interactions, memories, and possibilities, the more emotionally significant those thoughts can become. A person who rarely occupied her thoughts before may suddenly become a regular presence in her mind simply because she is trying to understand what changed. Each reflection creates another reason to reflect again. Each unanswered question creates another moment of curiosity. Each memory brings forward another memory. Over time, she may realize that she is spending more mental energy thinking about you now than she ever did when you were consistently trying to gain her attention, and that realization itself can become another question her mind feels compelled to explore. As time passes and the initial confusion begins to fade, another powerful realization can start forming in her mind. Maybe he finally respects himself. This thought carries a completely different emotional weight than curiosity or uncertainty. It shifts her focus away from wondering why you stopped chasing and toward understanding what your decision says about you as a person. For a long time, she may have become accustomed to seeing you as someone who was always willing to pursue, always willing to wait, and always willing to invest effort regardless of how much effort was returned. While persistence can sometimes be admired, there is a point where excessive chasing begins to communicate something entirely different. It can suggest that a person's happiness depends on being chosen. It can create the impression that they are willing to accept almost any level of inconsistency as long as they remain connected. When that pattern suddenly changes, the message changes as well. Instead of appearing dependent on her attention, you begin to appear independent of it. One of the most attractive qualities in any individual is self-respect, because self-respect communicates value without requiring words. People often talk about confidence, but genuine confidence is not found in constant self-promotion or attempts to impress others. True confidence is revealed through behavior. It is demonstrated when someone understands their worth and acts accordingly. When you stop chasing, especially after making consistent efforts for a long period of time, it can signal that you have reached a point where you no longer need external validation to feel secure. You are no longer trying to convince someone to appreciate you. You are no longer exhausting yourself to gain attention. You are no longer placing another person's choices above your own sense of dignity. That shift is often noticed, even if it is never openly discussed. What makes this realization particularly powerful is that people often view someone differently once they stop seeking approval. During the chasing phase, much of your identity may have been associated with your pursuit. She saw the effort, the messages, the attention, and the attempts to stay connected. Those actions may have overshadowed other aspects of your personality. When the pursuit ends, however, a different version of you becomes visible. Suddenly, you appear as someone who has boundaries, someone who values their time, someone who understands that relationships should involve mutual effort rather than one-sided investment. This new perception can create respect because it demonstrates emotional strength. Emotional strength is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It is about knowing when continued effort is no longer serving your well-being. There is also a significant psychological difference between someone who stays because they have no other option and someone who stays because they choose to. When you continuously chase, regardless of the response you receive, it can sometimes create the impression that you will always remain available. Your presence starts to feel guaranteed, but when you stop, you demonstrate that your life continues whether someone reciprocates your feelings or not. You show that you have standards for how you expect to be treated. You communicate through action rather than words that your attention is valuable and that it should not be taken for granted. This realization often changes the way people evaluate your character because it replaces an image of neediness with an image of self-worth. Another reason this thought becomes so impactful is that self-respect often inspires reflection. She may begin looking back at the dynamic between the two of you and noticing things she previously ignored. She may realize how much effort you consistently gave. She may recognize moments when you were patient, understanding, and available despite receiving very little in return. More importantly, she may start understanding why you eventually chose to step away. Rather than viewing your silence as punishment or manipulation, she may begin seeing it as a decision rooted in personal growth. A decision made by someone who finally recognized that constantly chasing a person who is not equally invested comes at the cost of self-respect, emotional energy, and personal peace. The more she considers that possibility, the more she begins to see your withdrawal not as weakness, but as evidence that you finally reached a point where you valued yourself enough to stop accepting less than you deserved. Among all the thoughts that can enter her mind when you stop chasing, perhaps none is more powerful than the question, "What have I lost?" This thought is different from curiosity, confusion, or even respect. It goes much deeper because it forces a person to evaluate the true significance of someone after they are no longer actively present. While you were consistently pursuing her, the focus may have been centered on whether she wanted your attention, whether she was interested enough to respond, or whether the connection was worth exploring. The dynamic revolved around your efforts and her reactions. But when you stop chasing, the entire perspective begins to shift. Suddenly, the question is no longer about what you are willing to give. The question becomes about what she may no longer have. That change in perspective can create a level of reflection that was impossible while your attention remained constantly available. Human beings often struggle to accurately measure the value of something while they possess it. Familiarity has a way of reducing appreciation. When something becomes a regular part of life, it slowly fades into the background. We notice it less, think about it less, and sometimes underestimate its importance. This happens in friendships, relationships, careers, and countless other areas of life. The presence of something valuable can become so normal that it no longer feels valuable. It simply feels permanent. When that presence disappears, however, the mind is forced to evaluate its true impact. What once felt ordinary suddenly feels significant. What once felt guaranteed suddenly feels uncertain. The absence creates a contrast that makes value easier to recognize. As she begins reflecting on your absence, she may start revisiting memories with a new perspective. Conversations that once seemed routine may now carry emotional meaning. Moments of support that she barely acknowledged at the time may stand out more clearly. She may remember how available you were during difficult periods, how consistently you showed interest, how patient you remained, or how much positive energy you brought into her life. These reflections often occur because the mind naturally compares present circumstances with past experiences. Once your attention is gone, she gains an opportunity to compare life with you to life without you. That comparison can reveal things she never fully appreciated while they were happening. Another important factor is that loss tends to create clarity. While someone is available, people often focus on what they wish were different. They notice flaws, imperfections, and unmet expectations. But once that person is no longer there, the focus often shifts. Instead of concentrating on what was missing, the mind begins noticing what was present. The qualities that once seemed ordinary become easier to appreciate. Kindness becomes noticeable. Consistency becomes noticeable. Loyalty becomes noticeable. Emotional availability becomes noticeable. Characteristics that may have blended into the background suddenly become difficult to replace. She may begin realizing that finding someone who genuinely cared, invested effort, and remained consistent was more valuable than she originally believed. This realization can become even stronger when she encounters other people. As she interacts with different personalities, she may start comparing those experiences to the connection she once had with you. She may notice that not everyone is patient. Not everyone communicates with sincerity. Not everyone is willing to invest time and emotional energy without expecting immediate rewards. The qualities she once viewed as normal may begin appearing increasingly rare. Comparison often has a way of revealing value because it highlights differences that were previously overlooked. Through those comparisons, she may start recognizing that your presence contributed more to her life than she initially understood. What makes this question so emotionally significant is that it forces her to confront possibility rather than certainty. While you were chasing, she always had the option of responding later, investing more effort later, or exploring the connection later. The opportunity felt available whenever she decided she wanted it. Once you stop chasing, however, that sense of certainty begins to disappear. The possibility that you may never return becomes real. The possibility that you may move forward with your life becomes real. The possibility that someone else may recognize and appreciate your value becomes real. Those possibilities transform a casual connection into something that suddenly feels meaningful because it may no longer be accessible. The mind begins calculating not what was offered, but what may have slipped away, and that realization often carries a weight far greater than anything she felt, while the opportunity still seemed guaranteed.